afternoon, everyone. My name is Clara Teber. I work at Open Forum Europe, and I started working there since October last year. And I would like to welcome you all to this fourth webinar of the European Open Source Academy. Just a note that, yes, as we were just saying with Anya, this webinar will actually be recorded, and we just started it, so beware. The European Open Source Academy is a new institution that basically seeks to amplify the public recognition of open source software and hardware. Its flagship event is the annual European Open Source Awards that took place twice already and takes place annually during the EU Open Source Week in January, the last week of January. And it was established as an explicit goal of uniting and kind of recognizing individuals and organizations that have demonstrated exceptional commitment to advancing open source software and hardware across Europe. So today's webinar is also seeking to do this actually, and the Academy aims to be a platform for thought leadership, policy engagement, and community development. Today, more specifically, we will explore how open source software and open standards can help address cloud vendor lock-in and contribute to a more competitive and interoperable cloud ecosystem in Europe. So in this discussion, we will focus on the structural challenges created by dominant cloud providers, the risks of dependency for public administration and companies, and of course, the role that open technologies and standards can play in restoring choice and market competition. So this is all especially relevant because in the course of this year, the Commission will be proposing the Cloud and AI Development Act, and it will basically be relevant to all open source projects and businesses existing in Europe. So I'm very happy to have today a very diverse group of speakers that will each bring a kind of different perspective on the topic. And they're all coming from different corners of this ecosystem, so welcome. We will actually start by a short introduction by our European Open Source Academy member, Dries, who is the founder and project lead of Drupal, as well as the co-founder of Acquia. So Dries, can I please start by asking basically how open source projects like these can drive competition and reduce lock-in? The word is yours.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, happy to answer. Maybe before I jump in, just to provide a little bit more context, as you mentioned, I started the Drupal project and also co-founded Acquia, which is an open source company. But Drupal powers about 1 in 30 websites around the world. And we have more than 10,000 people contributing to Drupal every year. And as for Acquia, we're, I think, one of the largest open source companies in the world with over 350 million in revenue each year. And Drupal is used today by governments and enterprises around the world. That includes actually the European Commission, and the main website for Europe is being powered by Drupal or United Nations or the Australian government that has standardized on Drupal, and not just governments, but also many large organizations. Nestle, largest food company in the world, also European company. They have over 4,000 Drupal sites, and very similar numbers with like Pfizer and Novartis, or even Airbus in France. And so, Drupal is being used a lot, I would say, across Europe. And the reason I mention that is because I think many people understand open source as a license, as a way of building products, as a way of innovating. But I think what is often overlooked is kind of what sits around it, because in the world of Drupal, for example, there's thousands of digital agencies, small or large companies in Europe and outside of Europe that basically have built their business on Drupal. These are the companies that bring Drupal to the market, that build websites using Drupal for their customers, and many of them obviously here in Europe. And some of the largest ones have hundreds of employees. Capgemini, we have Capgemini on the call as well, but they have a multi-million-dollar Drupal business across Europe alone, as an example. And so if I were to guess, there's probably at least 100,000 people making money with Drupal around the world. And that's just a guess. But essentially, a project like Drupal or open source more broadly, it's really providing jobs and services and promoting the local economic activity. And I think I think that's actually a very important point because open source isn't just about creating software. It's not just about a license for software, but it's actually, I would say, creating markets. It's creating jobs all around Europe, and that's really important, I think, right now. And then obviously, I don't have to explain open source to most of you or to any of you, but typically open source removes sort of artificial locking. You're not trapped by proprietary formats or proprietary APIs or proprietary licensing. And so with open source, you can, switch providers, you can self-host, you can extend it any way you want. And actually that is very good for competition because when organizations have a real choice, competition actually increases. And what open source forces organizations to do is to compete on value. You actually have to deliver something of value that people really love. And you can't really lock in people. You can't, compete on being sort of a dependency. And when vendors have to compete on value, that is ultimately better for end users. It's a better value proposition. It's a better deal, and that's what we've seen over and over again. Not just with Drupal and Acquia, but with all open source, really. And in the case of Drupal, it's we're more secure, more scalable, more extensible, easier to use, and ultimately that's better for all of the end users. So, I would say, open source, don't just think of it as a licensing or even a development methodology, but think about it as something that can really drive innovation and can provide better value for end users, and in doing so, make Europe and basically any country more competitive in that sense.
Thanks so much, Dries, for this first perspective a bit. And I would like to ask you actually, because you do wear many hats, and one of them is as member of the European Open Source Academy. And so can you tell us quickly, why do you think that the European Academy cares about this topic? And why does the cloud market represent such a critical dimension of the open source work for the EU especially?
Yeah, well, let me tackle the last question first, if that's okay, and then I'll close with your first question, because I think it will help me frame kind of the last question. But I think open source in many ways has won, right? It's everywhere. We've reduced a lot of lock-in at the software layer, as I just mentioned, but then in kind of a funny way, we reintroduced some locking at the cloud layer. And so today, the dependencies often come from the infrastructure, maybe using proprietary cloud services and proprietary cloud APIs. And so even though the application can be open and is open with open source, many organizations still feel themselves a bit constrained. And so in many ways, the cloud is now becoming a critical dimension in addition to open source, because the cloud is sort of a foundation of the digital economy. And if that layer has too much lock-in, it basically limits the benefits of open source applications that sit on top of it. So if we care about the things that I just talked about, competition, innovation, reducing lock-in, we now also have to care about the cloud more. And I think Europe is getting that right, with the policies that they're creating, because we need to focus more on things like portability, interoperability, exit options, if you will, the ability to move between clouds and platforms. And so I think that's really, really important. And actually, to be clear, many clouds actually allow you to do that, right? It's it often depends on the APIs that you use. And so I would say a lot of that is actually in control of the builders, of the end users, of the software developers that are using these clouds. And so that then bridges into digital sovereignty or software sovereignty, which is obviously a big topic in Europe today. And I've actually been writing a lot about it on my blog, if you're interested. But essentially, I've been thinking about it in terms of a spectrum. Software sovereignty, digital sovereignty. It's not like binary. It's really about the freedom of control, the ability to be in charge, and that's a spectrum. And on the one end, you can be highly dependent on a single proprietary vendor and basically have no freedom. And on the other hand, you can have a lot of choice. and have a lot of freedom. And open source is a critical component to that. You can only have a lot of choice if you use open source, because it's the only option that gives you a lot of freedom of control. And I think that's an important thing that a lot of people don't fully understand yet. Because, as an example, proprietary European software is not digital sovereignty, because a European headquarter is basically a temporary state. Like, it can change overnight, it can change with one board meeting, and there's plenty of examples of it. Like Skype would be a great example. Like, Skype was a European company. It checked every single digital sovereignty checkbox, and then overnight it was sold. And it left Europe. And so it was supposedly a sovereign solution, but it's not. And so that's a good example of the problem that I think we need to solve, and that open source can solve and does solve. And so when I hear people talk right now, there's a lot of sort of like, buy European, but it's not the answer. Honestly, the answer is open source, because buy European, like Skype, it can literally change overnight. And so I think policymakers, they're often underestimating licensing, and they're overestimating jurisdiction, where a company is headquartered, for example. And I think we need to fix that. And we need to fix that in the current cloud sovereignty framework. And I wrote a blog post with concrete suggestions, but maybe more importantly, because the impact is much bigger, we need to make sure that our policymakers get this right in the soon to be released Cloud and AI Development Act that you mentioned, because that's about to be released very soon. And if they just take things from the cloud sovereignty framework, I think they'll get it wrong. And so we need to basically be very clear about this and help policymakers understand that. So, basically to wrap this up, I think open source is important. Digital sovereignty is important. And there's a lot that Europe can do to help with this, like, can invest in open infrastructure, it can fund open source, like public infrastructure. I think that's really important, because so many critical services depend on open source, but very little does the European Commission contribute back to open source. I mean, France alone, just to put it in perspective, France alone has over 1,000 Drupal sites in the government. The European Commission has hundreds of Drupal sites, critical services, and very little do these institutions contribute back to Drupal. And it's a little bit sad, because I remember biking in Belgium just a few months ago, and I was biking past a sign that said they were investing 7 million euros in building a bridge for bikes, which is wonderful, obviously, but like $7 million is a lot of money. And I was thinking, if only they would contribute 7 million to Drupal, that would benefit so many people and so many critical services that are built on Drupal. So these are the kinds of things I think the European government and governments need to do, and some of that is happening, which is good, but I think we can do a lot more. And so, basically, open source started as a way to build better software, but today it does a lot more than that, right? It creates markets, it enables competition, it reduces lock-in, and we have to extend some of these principles to the cloud, per your question. And I think ultimately can help Europe build a digital economy that's more competitive, more innovation, more in control of its future. And that's why I joined the organization. It's why I joined the Open Source Academy, because a lot of the challenges of open source are no longer technical challenges. And I'm a technical person. I'm not a policymaker or anything, but today's challenges, today's questions, I would say, with open source, they're economic, they're political, they're strategic. And I think I joined the European Open Source Academy because I think we need better alignment between the builders, the software people, if you will, between businesses, between policymakers, between governments. And yeah, that's what I'm trying to spend some of my time on right now, because open source as a license, open source as an innovation model, that has already matured. But our policies and our funding models are the ones that I believe are still catching up. So.
Thank you so much, Dries. That was super interesting. I'm happy actually to give out the word now to Felix Kronlage-Dammers from the Open Source Business Alliance, who will also dive into actually the role of open standards and frameworks specifically on the sovereign cloud stack. Felix, the word is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Clara, and thanks, Dries, for this nice start. And you're already midway in your intro, Dries. You said that open source has won, but cloud put a different or new dimension to that whole game. And I'm paraphrasing that, of course, but that is exactly what Sovereign Cloud Stack set out to tackle and make sure that the open source idea is also taken to this cloud dimension. And SCS is a European initiative that creates an open, transparent, and vendor-neutral cloud ecosystem that guarantees sovereignty. And what we are sharing here right now is these three pillars. And SCS was originally a funded project by the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action in Germany, and it was funded throughout 2021 until 2024, and was hosted by the OSBA. And as part of that funding project, we were able to work on certifiable standards for the cloud, and also make sure that we do not just come up with certifiable standards, but also create a modular open source software stack that fulfills these standards. And that is the answer to the question, okay, I'm starting new, I'm doing a greenfield cloud project, I want to build a new cloud, what software should I take? And of course, as infrastructure becomes more and more complex, I mean, for people that have been in the infrastructure game for a bit longer, it's a complete different game now than in the end of the 90s and the 2000s. Infrastructure is very, very complex these days. And so the very important third pillar is knowledge transfer and what we also call open operations. So basically, maybe you know the four opens of the Open Infra Foundation, and the fifth open, as Kurt Galov and I coined it, was then the open operations idea. And with all these three pillars, we basically build up a sovereign cloud stack. And GC already mentioned the cloud sovereignty framework, and the idea also behind the cloud sovereignty framework, but also what SDS does is basically make the idea of sovereignty or digital sovereignty in the cloud actually something that is measurable and that you can quantify to a certain extent. If you please flip to the next slide, you will see what we mean if we talk about also the certifiable standards. Thanks. And what we within SCS said is, if we talk digital sovereignty for cloud, we talk about four levels that we apply. And the bottom one, we start on the bottom, but the first is the compliance with regulations, and that is what for a long time people mistook digital sovereignty with data sovereignty. And compliance with regulations is basically the GDPR aspect, so the legal jurisdictions. And within SCS, we said, well, basically, we do not worry about that. We assume that is being taken care of by other organizations and regulatory frameworks that are not SCS specific. And on the second level, we first talk about freedom of choice between multiple providers. Dries already mentioned the interoperability, that you are actually able to interchange stuff, and also that you potentially have an insourcing option on premises. And we basically correlate that to a technical compatibility. So that's what we call SCS compatible, and that's also what we currently certify. So basically, if you conform to a set of technical and standards, you're technically compatible, and we call that SCS compatible. But, and that is very important, that is not the overall game. It's taken further. The next level is the technological transparency, and again, Dries already mentioned quite a few aspects of that, and it's also the ability to participate and shape developments. And as open source gives us a lot, and basically if we just solely rely on the technical compatibility, we miss out a whole lot. And that's basically what we call then SCS Open. And the idea behind SCS Open is that you do not only have open APIs and are interoperable, but you actually provide a bill of material for the functional stacks, and you're fully open source compliant, so that people that actually use your cloud stack can actually even take it and modify it and make it better or adapt to their needs. And then I would say the topmost dimension is the operational transparency and accessible knowledge, and that's what we call then SCS sovereign, and that's basically the one where we talk fully digital sovereignty, because not only you have a fully open source stack that you can use, but also you can apply the knowledge from open operations and participate in knowledge exchange. And the idea of the whole open source culture is that together we are stronger, together we are better, and that is exactly what we also want to apply to the operation of infrastructure. And what we actually have seen already in the funding project, and what has happened since then, I will elaborate on that also shortly. But what we already saw in the funding project is that competitors that actually had competing cloud offers, that they started working together and actually updating the test labs together in order to become better. And the idea that we sparked there and wanted to make sure is that it's not about one customer that switches between one cloud provider in Germany to the another cloud provider in Germany, but it's about the overall customer base that is locked into proprietary offers or that are still on premise that needs to be worried about. And once people are locked into proprietary clouds, there's hardly any way out. So that's basically what needs to be worried about. And I said initially that it was a funded project until 2024, and we were actually able to sustain that project further beyond the funding, because right now 19 members companies of the OSSBA actually committed to paying an additional amount of money into the OSBA in order to fund that we have 1.8 FTE working on orchestrating the SCS ecosystem. So compared to the funding, it's not a whole lot, but it shows that there is a need in the market for it, and that companies are actually willing to spend money to make sure to sustain the community and the effort, and make sure that the neutral aspect and the standardization and certification, that is the neutral aspect that we need to have, that this is basically taken care of, and this is still hosted by the OSBA. So that's my short take on standardization certification for the cloud.
Thank you so much, Felix. Actually, talking about lock-in, now we're going to move on to Paolo Vecchi, so the CEO at Omnis Cloud, and he's going to also discuss policy and digital sovereignty and how can European governments leverage open source and standards to regain control over their digital infrastructure and reduce dependency. Paolo, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I've been, quite involved in open source for quite a long time. About 26 years of my 40 years careers in IT, actually. And naturally, I've seen all the evolutions, all the approaches to open source, and then as Andreas said earlier on, actually when open source seems to be about to, let's say, win the battle, cloud all of a sudden appear. So all the open source suddenly ended up in the so-called cloud, and all the interest has been there. But the point is that even the cloud as we see it, so from Felix's presentation, is based on open source. So you always be there, and particularly we always be there, and even large organizations that close you into their cloud services, they can do that because they base the whole infrastructure on open source software. So that is the important message that unfortunately hasn't gone through, let's say, for many years, especially to policymakers, decision makers that actually haven't understood the opportunity to actually leverage open source. And at this point, then also leads us to the various discussion about digital sovereignty. Also, they said we go to buy European open source and so on. I mean, we know that open source is global; it's not European. So that it's not the point of having a European product that makes the difference. Is actually implementing digital sovereignty that is also comprised of at least, probably more, at least of the two elements, which is actually the use of proper open standards and the users of open data. So these are the kind of elements that hopefully now are going through, but on top of it, also the various elements that include the benefits of using open source. Namely, also the creation of local skills. So you actually create the technology, the innovation that you need locally, which then you can also distribute in a wider circle, or in this case with open source globally. And you fund that actually with probably some saving that you can make by stop paying many of the licenses, or in this case, the fee of cloud services that at the moment most organizations, most government institutions are paying to a handful of providers. If I'm not mistaken, I see numbers passing by recently of about 298 billion euros going out in software licensing or something similar. That's a huge amount of money. I mean, just imagine how much SCS could achieve with a tiny fraction of the money. So being able actually to say, okay, we need a certain type of technology, and we actually work on it together to deliver it, because in a way the funds could be made available. That is really important. We see the example from Germany, from France, from the Netherlands. They say, well, we need an open source office suite, okay, to cover what proprietary system are at the moment are providing to many users, and they go together and say, well, here it is, and then on top of it, they just adapt it to their requirements. So each department could have implemented the change that they need for for their specific work environment. So that shows that it's possible to do many things with open source, and we are actually about to do many things, because in a way the unfortunate, let's say, geopolitical situation push many governments, many institutions in saying, well, we need to improve our resilience. We need to actually be able to control the technology that we use. So all the hard work that we, members of, let's say, the various open source community have done in the past many years, now is actually being seen and say, well, hold on a sec. Yeah, we actually have the people, we have actually the project in which we can invest to control our technology, to control our data, and maybe also finally become also GDPR compliant, as a good side effect. There is still work to be done, especially within institution, because there are several layers that are kind of obstructing a bit, let's say, the innovation, the take on of open source. Actually, the general awareness that people are actually already using open source all over the places is already important. I mean, you're using the internet is open source. Everything is open source. That is already a kind of layer of awareness that is important when you're using a known office suites made by a specific provider. All the software stack that they are using to present to you on the web page, this office suite is all based on open source. So we need to work on this level of awareness, but then we need to work as let's say, at the procurement level as well. Even there, we have situation where the standard is, okay, let's just renew the usual licenses or the usual cloud services that we had for years, because that is, in a way, the easy solution. From that level, there is no kind of push or incentive to actually look for the alternative. So these are from one side we have the technical department that they know that internally, at least for those that still have an infrastructure, they know that they're using open source all the time, and that is disconnected with from the procurement department. They say, we need to buy 1,000 licenses of this software. There is a kind of disconnection there. One of the policy of the entities that should be in there in all those institutions is actually the open source program office. The OSPOs, open source program offices, are being now created a bit all over the places, and is excellent because we already see in a way some of the results of the work that they can do by just connecting the knowledge, connecting the people within the institutions. But naturally, more needs to be done. We need to have, let's say, the OSPO in a way at the same level of the DPO within the organization in the management layer, to say, okay, guys, let's talk with finance, procurement, technical. At the moment, we are spending how much? 150 million, for example, in our government, just to make an example, in Microsoft licenses. Can we, from the financial point of view, reduce that cost? And the technical side could say, well, we have this solution, and the OSPO in the middle to say, okay, this is how we can integrate everything together. And we can, by the way, also work with other government or that other institution, because we know that they already developed what we need. So why not doing it? So by having the OSPO at this level, I think we can very quickly achieve very positive changes. So that is one of the things that, from the policy point of view, so making the OSPO as part of the standard policy of this standard part of the every institution is extremely important. There are also other elements that could be implemented as policies, like saying, okay, this solution must be interoperable, or this cloud service must be able to interact with other cloud services. So if I need a specific workload to be moved to my own cloud, because naturally the technology are there to have also your own internal cloud is not as complex as it seems. So moving this workload between my own cloud or other local cloud, or for other services that are just public and present little to no risk in terms of data sovereignty and technology sovereignty, even move it at a certain point somewhere else. So this type of exchanges will also facilitate the move, to more sovereign solution, so that we break also this lock-in where I say, yeah, but as a simple example, Interior using this database engine in this cloud service, well, I'm expecting that I can move the database into another cloud and it works exactly the same. Now, at the moment, even an open source cloud engine is being modified and tweaked in a certain way to make sure that it's very difficult for you to move that workload. So these are kind of the things that can be changed. Then another couple of simple things. Let's talk about again, as the example of the Office suite. We have a lock-in, because if you have to use the Office suite, you need to use also that specific authentication platform. So that already creates another lock-in into another environment, and that you can use these services without using the external services. So there are open source solutions to do that. We can implement it. The last example is also simple documents. You cannot in a way have proper interoperability, still use some fake standard. So the simple thing of saying, let's change Word documents, well, that stops the interoperability with open source solution. And this is one of the first choices that, for example, Schleswig Holstein made to adopt ODF, so the Open Document Format, as a standard format so that there will be no issue with document exchanges. These are just a few ideas.
Thank you so much, Paolo. So we still have 3 speakers that I really want to hear from. So we are moving on to Ritesh, the Chief Technology Officer at T-Cloud Public, formerly Open Telecom Cloud. Ritesh, the word is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Paulo, and thanks everyone. So I will be a little bit quick because the time is running up. So yeah, so I have a different approach thinking about interoperability, because I think the technology is there in most of the public clouds. What you see with respect to having infrastructure services, for example, right? But the main things I see in Europe specifically is the real adoption of multi-cloud. So multi-cloud is still relatively slow. In order to have innovation, we need to have the similar ecosystem collaborate, yeah, where the open source obviously plays a critical role. Take example of most of the public clouds, or where diversified clouds today are based on OpenStack. For the past decades, yeah, if we don't have such things available, we could not have the diversified cloud ecosystem, right? So accelerating this in collaboration is very essential for innovation. But at the same time, if the customer applications are not built in an interoperable way, yeah, that is something. If a customer thinks interoperability is something they can add later, then it becomes a very difficult choice for them to migrate. For example, I was looking into this customers where they have like serverless functions, yeah, serverless functions with proprietary databases or event systems, and they have developed such a strong dependencies over time that it makes migration very complex, right, and limiting the feasibility of multi-cloud. If we don't have such strategies from with the early stage in the application development, yeah, then it might be very difficult to come, even though if the technology or even though the clouds are interoperable, but the customer themselves find it very challenging, and it might not be cost effective for them to make it happen. So most of the proprietary services appears to be more cost efficient performance initially, but in the long term it reduces the flexibility for them. So initially I think there should be an architectural discipline which is very important to design the applications or the end user application specifically on a multi-cloud strategy. The clouds which can talk to each other, the clouds which uses an open source technology like OpenStack, Kubernetes, or standard APIs like colleague said, SES. And this should not be just technical preferences, but there should be a strategic decision. Yeah, so I think the more sustainable way is to avoid what vendor lock-in is also multi-cloud. And the multi-cloud which built on open source technology across infrastructure layers, across platform as a service layers, right, across container, database, and this will help to scale effectively, and also it makes it interoperable for the customers and across environments. And if we really want to contribute in open source, that means we have to use similar technologies across Europe. Yeah, that's what my thoughts are. Very quick and short.
Thanks so much, Ritesh. That's great. Actually, we thought of combining then the Q&A and the discussion panel so that we can all have more time to take questions from the audience later after hearing from Gina and Stefan. So thank you, Ritesh, once again. Building back on what Paolo mentioned, actually about OSPOs, we have Gina Platt here with us, who is the ad interim lead of the Dutch Ministry of Interior and Kingdom Relations, OSPO. So Gina, the floor is yours.
Yep. Awesome, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. I'm with the government OSPO in the Netherlands. We are strong advocates for open source and open standards. We do a lot of policy influencing on this. We had a major win in 2020 with the open unless policy. So when you procure or build software, it has to be open source unless, and the unless is chosen less and less to our excitement. We also influence other policies. We've seen our wording like open source and digital sovereignty being put into the most recent coalition accord, but also in the national cloud policy framework coming out soon. Besides that, we do a lot of projects that involve moving away from big tech and vendor lock-in to open source alternatives such as Mijn Bureau, which is the Dutch equivalent of the French La Suite, and the German Open Desk, the open source office suites. And we are now working on a national code platform to replace GitHub with Forgeo. So that's all on the application layer. We're also working on helping with incorporating open source and open standards in cloud policy frameworks on a national level. So, for example, as Ritesh just mentioned, to advocate for OpenStack and for Kubernetes instead of proprietary platforms. And that is also where one of our main challenges lay at this moment, because there is still a lot of, there are the best intentions with policymakers, and we see this back in policy, but there's still a lot of unfamiliarity with some of these alternatives because we have been leaning on proprietary solutions for so long from AWS and from Microsoft Azure. So our people are trained in those technologies, and we now need to move towards alternatives. So there's a big gap in policy and the actual execution. And as a knowledge partner, the OSPO tries to bridge that. As such, I am optimistic about the future of open hardware and open infrastructure. The national cloud policy that is about to be published is in the Netherlands, gives us a 3-level course of action for options, basically, for cloud infrastructure and hosting. So if something is very important and confidential, it needs to be on government cloud infrastructure, which is a problem of its own because it's not very well developed yet, not to the level of, say, a hyperscaler. But fortunately, there are a lot of public and private cloud offerings now in the Netherlands and in the EU as well. So I'm very excited to see all of these developments on Eurostack and Gaia X and all of these other collaborations Europe-wide. And then the last level, if it's not that confidential, if it's not that important, it can go on to a hyperscaler. But of course, we would still prefer European solutions there as well. So from the OSPO side, we're very strong proponents of European and Dutch cloud infrastructure, and we're also helping the government to choose open standards within their own data centers. But that is an ongoing challenge.
Thanks so much, Gina. That's very concise, and it's actually very good to have this public sector perspective. And that allows us to move to another perspective with Stefan Zozel from Capgemini, who is the VP Global Cloud Lead for the public sector at Capgemini. And he's now going to talk about about how can large transformation partners like Capgemini drive open cloud adoption in the public sector. Thank you, Stefan.
Yeah. Hello, Clara. Many thanks for having me. I'd like to give you some ideas about the industry perspective we have as a global system integrator. The main focus area we have as a GSI is to help clients to do large transformations. And that's a missing piece from my point of view in the open source economy. So we believe here that open source can or will take a major role in our future digital transformations. So we hear that from the policymakers, from the political people, from the parties, from the open source economy. But when we like to do that kind of transformation, we need to assure that the frame conditions for such a transformation is staffed properly. And that has to deal with things like governance, compliance, change management, culture change. So a lot of non-technical stuff, but they are key to assure a successful project. And that's exactly the role we as Capgemini like to take here in this open source economy. Some weeks ago, we had the EU Open Source Policy Summit in Brussels, and Thibaut Kleiner had a chat on the panel, and he also mentioned that he's missing the GSIs to really help to enforce open source projects in the European Union for the member states as well as for the Commission and the European agencies. And I think that's something we need to take into account, to not talk only from the technology point of view, because transparency, interoperability, so that's the genetic of open source. Sometimes it's quite good, sometimes it could be better, but that's a development process. So that will not change the behavior of the public bodies. We need to show them how to interact with the community. And the community are very different players, from individual developers to smart companies, to niche experts, to communities, and to large players. And that's a role we like to provide to public bodies here, is to give a central spokesperson so that public bodies can interact with the open source economy. And the way around, that's something GSIs can also provide to the economy, to talk the right language, how a tender process, how a procurement process, this public body really works out at the end. Because that's also a quite complex process where we need to be very precise to apply to all the procurement rules public bodies have typically. And I can tell you, the vast majority of those requirements are also non-technology driven. So very much compliance, and we have circumstances, questions you need to respond to, just to become applicable to that kind of project. And that's a visibility we need to give to public bodies. Open source is mature. They have to understand it's part of many commercial products they use anyway, but they can have it as a sole product, as a sole technology as well, which also assures proper European value contribution for new technologies, for employees in the local countries or in the regions. But those small companies typically do not often negotiate or deal with large public bodies, and that's the big challenge. Most of our open source companies, they are not Microsoft, they are not Oracle, with having all these lobby organization and large teams addressing these public entities. And we need to create a good communication, a good joint collaboration between GSIs like Capgemini, and there are some more in Europe which are quite active and successful, with the open source economy in the back end, as well as with the public body in the front end, to build that bridge and bringing all these people together. So that's a role I see for Capgemini, to really act as an execution channel to bring open source to the places where we like to see it, be it in the backend in the cloud environment, be it on the front end. Gina, you just mentioned Mein Bureau, Open Desk, Glass Suite, also a very interesting environment. And especially when we talk about collaboration environment, the culture change and end user enablement program is a key element for such a migration program. Because when the user is not adopting and not accepting the new environment, it will simply fail, no matter how open, how transparent, how good technology is at the end. So we really need to assure that. And I just like to recommend to the community to look for system integrators to help to bring open source technology to those clients, and not only to the technical spokesperson, but to the business person, to the stakeholders of our public sector clients, and as well as to the public bodies, to require from the system integrators who typically hold all these different frame contracts, to establish those kind of communication, to have a single point of contact to the community, to upstream not only development but also funding budgets to really support these different companies in the background, that they can do the proper business within Europe. And that's at the end the environment we like to achieve in the sovereign discussion.
Thank you so much, Stefan. And actually thank you to all of the panelists. I suggest now that we can move on to kind of the second part. So let's group the Q&A and panel discussions parts to make sure that the audience can also have a say. I will hand out the word to Anya, to my colleague, to moderate this part.
Thank you, Clara. To be honest, this is mostly to voice the questions from the chat. So I would encourage anybody in the next few minutes, if you have writing. The first one is for Ritesh. Would you agree that the application DevOps teams should avoid using non-portable services because they cause a hard lock-in? So Ritesh, the floor is yours in this case.
Yeah, so what happens today is that most of the lower layer services like infrastructure services, they are able to move. So virtual machines, containers are really straightforward forward to move in. But what we see is that the technologies are advanced today with respect to website, with respect to high level because of use of AI. So the applications are not simply just virtual machines or container, but beyond with scalability, with respect to high availability, reliability with respect to various proprietary platform services they use, like for example, monitoring and logging and tracing, right? And these technologies often where the DevOps team, they find it easy to find to utilize through the existing cloud providers, and it makes them very vendor locked in with respect to one cloud provider. So I think one of the issues we have to sort it out is that how can we reduce the refactoring or even the rebuilding the parts of the application, and in that direction open source and standards will make a real difference when you have more higher portability.
Thank you, Ritesh. I'm actually going to build a question out of the discussion between Kurt and Gina in this case. So Gina, for all the audience, would you mind if we just touch upon briefly about sovereign washing statement and just why is procurement such a huge barrier when it comes to different cloud providers? So just to kind of recap
Sure.
the discussion you had in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, we were having a whole lengthy discussion in the chat, indeed. Building on very current events in the Netherlands going on, because there's a lot of sovereignty washing happening, where cloud providers will assure you that something is based in Europe, so it's fine, but unfortunately it's still under American jurisdiction. So according to the Cloud Act, it's out of our legal hands. The example mentioned in the chat was of the Dutch tax authority moving their a few of their primary processes to American companies, and if this could be stopped or not. Well, unfortunately, the move to Office 365 instead of the Dutch Mijn Bureau can't be stopped because that was part of a long standing agreement. But other moves are currently being reconsidered, so that is at least a win. In which case, they do need to ask themselves the question, can they build an alternative themselves if there is no European equivalent to that process, to that provider? In which case, I would say yes, of course, but we just need to build the capability to do so. And procurement comes in that sense. And I think Paulo mentioned it already, which I'm very happy about, because procurement is currently a huge barrier. There's a lot of policy with the best intentions to push us towards open source alternatives. And then as soon as it lands in procurement, there are all these rules that inhibit us from choosing for an open source company or organization simply because the organization is too small or doesn't have certain enterprise support licenses or an SLA, or there are other concerns. So from the OSPO perspective, we try to help with these barriers, and we try to bridge that gap between finding a solution and actually being able to buy it or to source it in or to build it ourselves. So I hope that answered the question.
I think it did a very nice recap of what we were discussing. So Clara, unless somebody else has a question, feel free to raise your hand or write it. We still have a few more minutes to address one or two questions.
Yes, otherwise, actually, I would build on this question and maybe ask the other panelists if you believe that besides, of course, procurement rules, there are other technical or economic barriers that prevent organizations really from switching between cloud providers today. If one of you has an answer to this.
Well, one of the things I learned within the last 2 years dealing with the public hand in Germany is that if we look at municipalities and their infrastructure, is that technical interoperability is actually the smaller piece of the puzzle if switching between providers, because the whole process and basically all that is kind of also involved, and that's also part of the equation. So that's actually one of the and often they basically the technical interoperability and the switching is then of course part of the we could potentially switch, but basically the overall process and what plays into all that is actually also part of the puzzle.
Thank you, Felix. I feel like Dries and Ritesh want to say something.
Yeah, yeah.
No, just
So
go ahead. Go ahead.
no,
Maybe
I was
Dries
just thinking.
first.
Yeah, when you said the economic cost of migration, so this is what I was thinking about, the data gravity. So because I think the past 10 years, data has increased so much that the data sitting on the big clouds are very large data sets in their analytics and this one. And because of AI, I think it's very, very cost intensive or cost expensive and very slow to move. Yeah, even the small differences takes a lot of time for customers to migrate, and this creates one of the physical, don't say practical challenges, yeah, during the migration, and that is what they try to avoid moving or migrating to a different cloud.
If
Thank
I
you, Ritesh.
may,
Dries?
Yeah, I was just going to
interject.
add. Sorry, go ahead.
Dries first, and then Paulo.
I was going to switch back to procurement, so maybe Paulo makes more sense to go first. I don't know.
Just a very brief comment in terms of linking the cost. So migrating wanted to bring an example just comes to mind because it's just one of the most recent one. Once again, in Schleswig-Holstein, we are talking about 40,000 users migrated from the usual legacy. Let's call them legacy platform to open source. Yeah, of course, they spent, if I'm not mistaken, about 9 million euros over a few years to do all the validation, test preparations, and so on. But then now they just save 15 million euros per year. So if somebody calculates the cost on a yearly basis, probably something even cloud is more cost effective. If you start calculating it over 2, 3, 5 years, well, the logical conclusion is no, we should own the technology, run the technologies. It's cheaper and is then kind of more flexible for our requirements. That was my brief comment.
Thank you, Paulo.
I was just going to add something to the procurement topic, and I think it's in addition to what Gina said. So, like one of the challenges that we see in Drupal is that contracts often go through digital agencies that do not contribute back to open source. And that actually the agencies that are contributing to Drupal, in our case, they get skipped over because of like it's not valued in the procurement criteria. And as a result, because they have often contributors on staff, their operating costs are a little bit higher, so they can always compete just on price. Because let's say like an agency of 10 people may have 1 or 2 people contributing to Drupal, and that's a cost, so to speak. And so I think the other thing that could change in my mind in terms of procurement is actually valuing or having a criteria in addition to things like price. I'm not saying price doesn't matter. Price does matter, but in addition to price, I think looking at things like are my vendors contributing to the development of the software? Because those vendors that do, they tend to, and I'm not generalizing, but often they are really experts. The people that help build the software are experts in the technology, and therefore it makes sense to work with them, because then you create this flywheel, because some of the public tax money goes back into the open source software, versus if you work with systems integrators or agencies that do not contribute back to the open source project, like you don't really help fund the infrastructure that your digital services depend on.
Thank you very much, Dries. And actually, I feel like that really kind of loops back to what you had said at the beginning. So it feels like the perfect conclusion to this webinar. I want to thank everyone, the panelists, and as well everyone who attended for coming. And of course, feel free to follow up via email if you need anything. But thank you very much, everyone. Have a great afternoon. And thank you for the conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks a
Thanks,
lot.
Ellen.
Goodbye, everyone. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.